What if the United Kingdom of Great Britain ends because the English make a similar mistake to what the Welsh did to lose England in the first place to the English? It would be a most bittersweet, supreme irony. And I think it is the most likely way that the United Kingdom will end, because regardless of what Welsh and Scottish nationalists think, hello, the ancient Norman aristocratic families of England are not just going to give you your own country like it's a preheated school dinner for free. Hello, this is Ben Llewellyn, and since the Scottish independence referendum in 2014 and the Brexit referendum in 2016, there have been loads of articles and videos forespelling doom and gloom upon the United Kingdom as Wales and Scotland break away to avoid some evil top-hat wearing social class of landlords plucked out of 1820 to scare us into fearing anything that's remotely pleasant, old-fashioned, and traditional. But they miss the point here on two accounts. One, English nationalism is what caused Scottish nationalism and Welsh nationalism in the first place, because they just kept saying British when they meant English, but they were afraid to say anything about England because they had this hang-up about nationalism being somehow evil, which again then later fed into the Conservative Party's crazy cocaine-fueled liberal capital beliefs, instead of actually being conservatives and conserving the country. 2. We were offered two very different versions of Brexit. One, which was to slow immigration, stop cultural change, stop social liberalism, return to cities that were culturally, well, more in England. I mean, I'm Welsh. This was mostly an English vote. Quite a lot Welsh as well. But to return to the idea of the nation and the national culture as being good. And second, a narrow faction of the Conservative Party to escape tax laws coming in through the European Union and keep their tax havens, bring in lots of work from Africa and Asia, cheap labor on the sly, to be able to keep their idea of 1980s economic liberalism and cocaine-fueled, yeah, let's get rich, to keep it going, right? Guess which Brexit we got? Here's a clue. We got a socially awkward prime minister with short trousers, with family ties to India, who goes around asking homeless people if they work in finance. Yeah. We got the Brexit that no one voted for except a small group of the Conservative Party. And the people, mainly the English people, were completely ignored. The cause of both the Scottish and Brexit referendums has not been addressed by the British establishment at all. Working class English people, and many Welsh here in Wales, are rightfully angry at the level of cultural and ethnic change in their country's cities, and more so the status quo which evolved after the baby boomer generation of ever-increasing social liberalism. They don't seem to think that people have the right to assert their national identity on any kind of hereditary, traditionalist, or ethnocultural basis whatsoever. In fact, they see it as bigoted and ignorant, which in itself is bigoted and ignorant because people are just going to become more and more intensely conservatively nationalistic if you refuse their native identity. Part 1. How did the Welsh lose England? Most people don't seem to even notice that the Saxon conquest of England took a really long time. It wasn't just a bunch of guys showed up with armor and killed people and took the land, though there was some of that. No, even into the 570s, well over 150 years after Rome left England, The Britons still controlled half of England at that point. Okay, it was the hilly bits and more the upland rivers and the west that was more rainy, but they still held almost more than half the land at that point. And in the mid to late 5th century, the Britons under Emrys Wledig, or Ambrosius Aurelianus, won a series of major battles, probably in the area from the Midlands just west of Birmingham, down along the eastern side of Morhavran, the Severn, and into the upper Tavwis, the Thames, with advances by several British warlords in the north, near England, and down along the Trent Valley, Avon Trenon. And all of these 5th century and early 6th century men together were slowly amalgamated, fused into the figure of King Arthur in Welsh and Cornish and Breton stories. But the key turning point in the battle between British and Saxons may have come down to plague. The plague of Justinian struck Britain in 554 and 555. Now at this point, the Saxons, Angles, and Jutes weren't tending to settle in the cities themselves, though they were beginning to. The Welsh, at least in England, were very urban, and the plague decimated them. This emptied cities further, which the Saxons were still not always eager to go into, but this changed. By the early 500s, the Saxons in the southeast and along the east coast had begun to control the urban areas, more densely populated. And when the plague emptied them out further, the Saxons were able to control densely populated areas like Bath, York, Lincoln, and in the Welsh legend of Llŷd and Llefelys, London itself, without even much of a fight. And it's interesting that until the Saxons controlled most of the cities, after the 570s, their conquest of England was not assured. There were strong British kingdoms in England itself at this point. Even after this, it took them most of another century to anglicize the native population in the east of England. And there were several things going on. Firstly, the Saxon and the Britons living behind enemy lines had separate legal systems. The British legal system did not reward Saxons enough for joining them. It discouraged people joining the Welsh-speaking culture, actually. But the Saxon legal system rewarded Britons slowly who gave up their own culture and just called themselves English, who gave up their cultural identity and strengthened the English by allowing them to assimilate the natives. The DNA didn't change that much. And that's second. The DNA shows that outside East Anglia and Kent, the number of Saxons who came was not that great at all. This was a minority culture with a different religion. At the time, initially, it did Christianize, but it had a different language and a different legal code, different laws, built on a loose confederation of different but similar nations. Jutes, East Saxon, West Saxon, Angles, which took control of city boroughs, like Leicester, Colchester, Winchester, Dorchester, London. And then they gradually expanded to connect these settlements along the roads between them, and to absorb the native British population into their culture by holding positions of economic worth and kingship, but more importantly perhaps, holding the most densely populated areas, so when those rural bumpkins who were still speaking Welsh in, the Fens, north of Cambridge, came into the city, there were so many people speaking their Saxon or Anglic language that they just got absorbed into it. Even after the year 1000, huge swathes of the north towards Scotland, Herefordshire along the west, cities in the southwest and Devon, Shropshire, Gloucestershire, these areas in England were all still heavily British, almost 600 years later. So this was a slow absorption of the native population, but the key thing to remember is it required them to hold the cities and create a parallel hegemony from within first. So why am I telling you this? What is happening in Britain today? It does bear some similarities to what happened after the fall of the Roman Empire, with new groups coming into new cities and building a dense population base from which to expand their culture and their power. Now, it's not going to be even remotely similar, but there are similarities. Part 2. British Conservatives and Islam. Now, I just need to highlight, this is not more about what the Conservatives did to Muslims or for Muslims, but what they didn't do. They did not seem to care about the cultural struggle any way, one or the other. They were so focused on making money, they completely ignored that the culture matters. By the 1920s, the British Empire ruled over half the world's Muslim population. That is significant. Now, what matters here is not actually what conservatives have done regarding cultural change, ethnic change, but rather what Labour has done more, and the conservatives, they've chosen to fight on economics rather than any cultural identity or national sentiment, really. Now you get spurts of populism, but it's superficial, it's shallow. The conservatives of the 20th century, or late 20th century, they were just concerned with making money. They weren't truly populist in any sense. And by populist, I don't mean that in a derogatory way, I just mean of the people. There have been a series of laws which explain how this has changed over the late 20th century. So 1948, this was the Labour Party. You had the British Nationality Act. Now what this was, it was trying to slow the decline of empire. They just lost India, and they still allowed them to be counted as British citizens, or British in the colonies, right? A citizen of the United Kingdom and colonies. And those peoples from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Newfoundland, India, Pakistan, then Rhodesia, Ceylon, which is Sri Lanka, were able to come. I mean, it wasn't easy, but they could come here fairly easily compared to other nationalities. In India, Pakistan, that's a massive chunk of the world. But I should note Yemenis immigration, a Muslim country, was already many decades old by this point. And Egypt, Kenya, all of these places were coming into Britain at this point, but far below 1% of the population was Muslim, right? So if someone's that much of a minority, it's no worry. No worry. That's fine. Let them come in. But it began to pick up pace. And by the early 1960s, there was a backlash, and the Tory government at the time, they passed the Commonwealth Act, the Commonwealth Immigration Act of 1962, which regulated Commonwealth immigrants and enabled some deportations and restricted work permits. So you see the beginnings of a reluctant step on the Conservatives to admit that the empire is over. But they don't want to exactly. They want that prestige over the other peoples. So they're not willing to fight on cultural basis yet. Now, Labour comes in, right? And in 1968, there's reforms of this act. The Commonwealth Immigrations Act, 1968. It reduced Commonwealth rights, but went out of its way, for the standards of the time, to avoid being called racist. Because there's rhetoric boiling up during this time in the late 60s in Britain. Because London, for the first time, has areas really that have a dense population that's not European origin, right? And that's changing things culturally. This act by Labour was the first to truly recognise that immigration, not just immigration, but cultural change from it is an issue that you must address because people were raising their voices. And one of these, just a month after this passed, a guy named Enoch Powell, he was an angry fellow.
The supreme function of statesmanship is to provide against preventable evils.
His speech, Rivers of Blood, probably robbed him of a highly prestigious cabinet position, and who knows what he could have done if he had just kept his mouth a bit. Come on, the guy was just calling for bloodshed, basically, and it was not okay. The Conservatives kind of nipped that in the bud. Your career's gone, buddy. But the Conservatives then unexpectedly won the 1970 election. Like, nobody could have guessed that. They thought they were headed for a catastrophe. And some, they say, maybe Enoch Powell's rhetoric actually boosted their vote, the Conservatives, because people were beginning to be aware. Well, Islam at this point was approaching 1%. There were different groups. There were Hindus. There were people from Malaysia. And this was, keep in mind, this is a country, or union of countries, where non-European populations had never been above anything that was kind of a sideshow. Like, whoa, what's that walking down the street? I mean, it's that different because this is a Caucasian homeland. And it's understandable that people were a bit taken off, like, what's going on? Now, no threat to the culture at that point, none at all. I mean, if there's that few, bring people in, why not? But it is causing a backlash. And the Conservative Party, focusing on money at this point to argue against the trade unions, completely ignores the cultural bit. They shirk from it as being uncouth, because the baby boomer generation was so socially progressive, the hippies and all that stuff. They didn't want to argue on anything cultural, right? But they kind of know it's an issue. And Ted Heath kind of moves Britain in towards what was becoming the European Union. And an immigration law is passed, again in 1971, which is very different. It's enabling people from Europe to come in to the UK. Much easier, and making it more difficult for people from like the Middle East, Africa, Asia, Caribbean to come in. It's a two-handed blade there, because two-handed blade, if they can get into Europe, they can just get into Britain. And there's this loophole. The Tories of the time understand this, but they're able to say to people, oh, we're handling immigration. We're dealing with it, without really dealing with it, because they're entering this new kind of ideology, neoliberalism, which uses cheap labor from abroad to push up their profits to stick in the pockets of their donors, which keep the party, the political party of the Conservatives, bankrolled. So we have a change going on. As we approach the 1980s, the Tories depend upon immigration to fund their party and make money. They see the country as a shop, basically, selling out their own people for profit. Thatcher was an expert at that, and brilliant politician, did not like culture very much. Which brings me to Peter Bruinvels and the era of neoliberalism which hollowed out inner cities across Britain and did something. Well, Margaret Thatcher, she was a revolution. And it wasn't a revolution against the radical left. No, her revolution was against social conservatism. It was an anti-conservative, conservative revolution to flood cities with empty areas. I mean, you ever heard that song, Ghost Town?
This town is coming like a ghost town.
That's what that's about. Empty cities, the community broken. But there is a community in these cities. It's these immigrant communities who have held on in these inner city boroughs. They've not left. But the British population begins to go out. And that's when Peter Bruinvels taps into this, the last Conservative to win in Leicester. He really does tap into this anger about an immigrant population in Leicester removing the native culture. And people are rightfully angry. I don't say that that's wrong. It's just he tapped into that anger that existed. It's not whether it's bad or good that it existed. It's the fact that it did exist. You either accept it exists or don't. But here's the thing. That population that came in the early 1962 Act, there was a flood of people right before that closed the gate. A lot of them went to Leicester. And that population overwhelmingly began to vote against Conservative rule. And so what happened is Bruinvels was the last Tory up to date who won that seat. And those who came after him, the MP Vaz, was brilliant in his statesmanship because he did something I don't think any British politician. He specifically used the immigrant descendant South Asian vote as his voter base to consolidate his power and use it against his opponents. He wasn't a Muslim, and it doesn't matter if he was. I want a Britain and a Wales where I can practice my faith. That's not what I'm getting at here. It's that he divided the society to gain his own political power. And that's what I'm getting at. He openly used the Muslim vote to his own benefit and ruled 32 years in his seat. That's incredible. But through his time, his constituency was moving further and further left because these groups, they're not going to vote Conservative. And the Conservatives ignored this. That was tremendously stupid. So you had someone else come in. Claudia Webb. I mean, she has a history of anti-Semitism, and these groups, many of these ethnic groups in these Muslim communities are highly anti-Semitic in beliefs. I mean, certainly not all of them. I've met some wonderful Muslims. It's just that I don't hear the moderates in the Muslim community speaking out against anti-Semitism very much. And she backed Ken Livingstone, which is an awful man, a Jew-hating man, who then, I think he looked at what Vaz, the MP, was doing earlier, and took on some of his tactics of exploiting these minority groups to gain his vote. But this woman, Claudia Webb, she backed Jeremy Corbyn, and she's now sitting as an independent because she was too extreme. But she has an immense support base in this group in Leicester. And the point I'm making with that is since Vaz's time, between the center point of his time in the late 80s and Claudia Webb under Jeremy Corbyn in 2019 coming in, there's a shift across Britain. Different politicians are using the same tactic, and they're using the Muslim vote to gain a base, a power base. Now, there's nothing wrong with appealing to the citizens, but it is going to become a problem if it continues to grow and there are whole regions where that vote is the majority, and that ethos begins to shift society. It will create a backlash in English society, and I think Brexit going into that is exactly what that was. But I get ahead of myself. Tony Blair, the first Muslim MP, was elected in 1997 as he came in, and there's nothing wrong with that. Not at all. In fact, I want different faiths as MPs. That's good. The issue is, look at this. 1 in 1997, then 2, then 4, then it doubled to 8, 13, 15, 19. You would expect it to fluctuate up and down if it's not an ethno-religious identity vote, but rather voting for people along competence. I want different groups of people to serve the people, but this trend is lockstep in sync with the growth of the Muslim population in Britain. It's an ethno-religious vote. It's not a vote on competence. It's not a vote on merit. It's a tribal affiliation. That's not healthy. Tony Blair made diversity kind of a cornerstone of his strategy to whittle away at the vote of the Conservatives. Over his rule, going into Gordon Brown, by the time the next non-Labour government came in, the Muslim population had increased by 1.5 million. I don't see how that's not intentional. Now, I'm glad that people chose Britain. At that time, I certainly did. That's when I came here. I'm an immigrant. I'm not knocking people for being immigrants. I'm just saying, if you look at Leicester, if you look at Birmingham, if you look at parts of East London, if you look at up in the northwest of England where the cretin, the insidious George Galloway just won a vote off of basically hating Jews and getting the Muslim vote for it. This is a dangerous trend, and you're seeing the ilk of Nigel Farage, Tommy Robinson, Lawrence Fox. There's quite a few others that are burgeoning up, these populist right-wing figures, because people have the right to be angry that the Conservative Party, which is supposed to represent the people of England, I'm Welsh, they're not listening to the English national consensus and identity. They're ignoring it. They're still in this, like I said about the, we have a banker, finance prime minister, who's basically the epitome of the Brexit that the people voted against. That's dangerous, because you have an underbelly of anger for me. You get my point. Let's jump to the next section. Part 3. Celtic nationalism and Islam. Now, I know what you're thinking. These two are not seemingly natural bedfellows, but there's a good reason why they've aligned with each other, and let me explain why it makes perfect sense, and why the British establishment should be terrified of this. In the past, I was active in Welsh nationalism. That's not a secret. I'm very proud to be Welsh. I'm very proud of yr iaith Gymraeg, the Welsh language. And studying the Welsh language certainly brought me into the Welsh nationalist sphere, no doubt. But one thing I did not expect was this semi-Marxist victimhood, guilt hierarchy that has permeated Welsh nationalism. When I came here, I think it had already begun, but I wasn't aware of it. It was still in its early phases. Leanne Wood had come in, and she was clearly very left, and clearly taking her influences from the ANC, the African National Congress, which is deeply into this and fixated on post-colonialism and decolonialism. And that word decolonialism sounds nice. Yeah, let's free people from being colonized, but that's not actually what it means. This is an ideology which seeks to remove and reshape history in order to create a guilt class within the society that exists. I mean, ask Afrikaans in South Africa what people are saying about them. I mean, people are openly saying they're going to murder the Afrikaans because they're white. And I wondered where Leanne Wood got these ideas and how would they infiltrate into Wales, where our nationalism was actually born out of liberalism and economic progress. I didn't quite understand this for a few years until I realized there's a lot of Irish flags going on. And then I was like, well, Ireland's got a centrist centre-right government. Oh, you mean the nutters in the attic? Sinn Féin? Like, wait, you actually want to be like them? And I looked into these people. I mean, Mary Lou McDonald, openly flirting with Cuba and the CCP in China and Hamas, Hezbollah, I mean, going on Al Jazeera. That's terrifying. And then I was like, well, is it in Scotland too? I mean, I have Scottish heritage. That it is. Why is this the case? I mean, look at Glasgow Football Club, Celtic. With this, I mean, I would dread to wear my kippah in the football stadium in Glasgow with like Palestinian banners and hate slogans being announced to around 50,000 people. It's like a citadel to anti-Semitism. What is going on in Glasgow? And I realized slowly there's this neo-Marxist idea that has fused with this intense hatred of the English, to the point where even if the enemy of the English is the enemy of the West, they'll side with the enemy of the West. And they've gone down this Marxian route because it enables them to hate the West and not seem like the bad guy in their minds, which to me is absolutely crazy. Just look at this video, what Kerry Harper's saying, and we'll digest it for you, yeah?
But this conflict didn't start on the 7th of October, and context is important. There is a long and difficult history in the Middle East, but this modern conflict started just over 100 years ago, and it started because of colonialism. And at that same time came the Balfour Declaration, a declaration by the British government to hand large swathes of Palestine to the Zionist movement. So it's colonialism, spearheaded by Westminster, that enabled this conflict.
So notice how she basically sums up Israel as being British. I mean, this doesn't take into any consideration that the overwhelming majority of the Jews in Israel at that time were refugees, physically chased by witch hunts and angry mobs out of the Middle East. That the majority of Israel are not Ashkenazi, which are the European Jews. And that the Ashkenazi Jews had just suffered the worst genocide in human history. I mean, at least one of the top 3 genocides, okay. You know, it was bad. These were refugees. They went to the one place where Jews pray towards 3 times a day, that way. And you speak of in your prayers that you talk about during Pesach, Passover, and I mean, all kinds of things that's connected to Judaism, and it is an ethnicity as well as a religion, and she doesn't seem to even remotely understand that this is a nationality, that this is where they're from, that when they went there they were attacked, not just by the Arabs, but by the British. The British tried to keep the Jews out at one point. And then this.
But the bottom line is that the current Israeli government are extremists. They are extreme right-wingers, and they're inflicting a brutal occupation and apartheid.
An apartheid is when you oppress your own citizens. The Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank are not citizens of Israel. There's no apartheid. There's no genocide because the population of the Palestinians has increased something like 500%. In a genocide, your population goes down. The extent to which Plaid Cymru has gone on and on about Gaza, it's just a ploy. They're using the Arab vote for political gain. They're using this war for their own benefit. That's not cool, for their own benefit. But it gets more sinister. Because You have Hamza Yusuf, the First Minister of Scotland, SNP guy. He said this. He called for Rishi Sunak to officially recognize the state of Palestine, less than 2 months after the worst slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust, to reward them for murdering people in the most savage, barbarian ways that you can imagine. And then about the same time, I mean before this actually, Ellen Mary Jones of Plaid Cymru, the Llywydd of our Senedd, refused to fly the Israeli flag during the worst moment for Jews since the Holocaust. This is disgusting. But why? I mean, there's a reason why this is happening. They're attacking England. It's nothing to do even with Wales or Scotland or Ireland. It's a way to attack England and divide English society. Now I understand, yeah, the English, I mean, you're a bit annoying. I mean, I'm sorry, but you do annoy me a lot, but I don't hate you. You're just like, oh, come on, can you just let us do our own thing in our own country? And you do your own thing in yours kind of thing? I don't hate you. But these people do hate you. And they want to cause ethno-religious tensions in your society to exploit it for our political advantage in Wales, in Scotland, and the nutters in Ireland's attic. That's not cool. And I'm just calling that out, Plaid Cymru, yeah? You don't do that to our neighbour. Because that's what they're doing. A lot of them sided with Jeremy Corbyn's lot and that radical... Well, a lot of English Marxist types, it's not Welsh nationalism, it's a Marxist victim oppressor-oppressed struggle that is using this Islamic growth to their own benefit. But long term, that's gonna stab them in the back. I'm not so concerned with what Sinn Féin has done in the past and the troubles or low-grade civil war or whatever you wish to call it, and all of those dark times. I'm concerned with their actions now, their neo-Marxist beliefs, their anti-Western values, their anti-Semitism, and their clearly and openly aligning with our enemies. I could go on more about Sinn Féin, but I think I should just best say what we have in Sinn Féin is a time capsule of hatred that, yes, it was useful once, but this is not 100 years ago. And the fact that Scottish and Welsh nationalists are tapping into that, it's immature, it's incredibly short-sighted, and frankly it's prejudiced. Given the length of this video, I still don't feel that I've done justice for the Celtic nationalism and Islam bit. If you would like a specific video on that, please let me know. However, for the time being, tap like and subscribe. Diolch yn fawr, thank you very much. Part 4, a dyfodol, the future. So what is going to happen? I challenge you in the comments. Can you show me once in history, where the growth of the Muslim population went beyond 15 to 20% and it did not cause riots, mass civil unrest, or civil war, or a period of anarchy, or a military coup d'etat, or some type of secessionist region? Show me once in history, just once, where that has not happened. We're at going up to 7% Muslim in the UK now, which I don't really have much of a problem with that. That seems reasonable. But the point is, it's not going to stay at that. And Charles de Gaulle, the guy who ran the French resistance in World War II and then was later like their leader for a while, he said, minorities in France are welcome so long as they stay a minority. We're getting to the point where this group is big enough to begin influencing this country. I do mean that in Wales as well as England. And that in itself's not a problem. I think the culture of Arabic and Islam has some very beautiful aesthetics and art and things that are of value to us. But we have Sharia courts, openly, that run according to Sharia, parallel with English common law. We have people who are seriously radical, who want a war against the British state. Now, I understand many of my viewers may not like the British state. You're Welsh or Scottish or Irish. I respect that. But we are part of a common Western civilization. We are part of a common British Isles identity. When I look at the future of Britain, I don't see how it is possible anymore to avoid some kind of civil conflict, either anarchy or religious schism, a coup d'etat, something. You cannot have millions upon millions of immigrants, and I say this as an immigrant, coming in over decades with entire areas of your cities changed culturally forever, without a backlash to come. And yes, there is a massive backlash coming in Britain, and it's coming precisely from that group who have been ignored and had their image of Brexit inverted and perverted in this twisted neoliberal low-tax version of Brexit, which is literally the opposite of what people who voted Brexit on the whole voted for. They voted for these enclaves of culture in their cities. They wanted it to reflect their values and cultural heritage again, not for them to be expanded under the pretext of lower wages for wealthy business owners and their tax donor havens and their pet MPs. That's basically what's happened, and I wonder if this is the end of the Conservative Party. Maybe not this election cycle, but we're going to see an increase in the radical right wing within the English part of the UK. I don't know how the Muslim population is going to react to that. Neither do I know how the Celtic fringe will react to that, or the radical left of places like Liverpool and East London. This island is becoming not just divided, but multi-polarized. You have the Celts, who, frankly, I don't see much similarity between Welsh and Scottish, though I love both of them. I mean, anyone watching this channel in Scotland, I love you guys, and Wales, my home. These two, yes, we share a lot, but this idea that Celtic is one thing doesn't really hold water. Just in the sense that Muslims in Britain are not one thing. They come from Pakistan, Bangladesh, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Yemen, many other places. I don't know how this is going to ferment and form into a cohesive force, but if Islam is keeping on growing as it has, we're looking at 13 to 15 million Muslims in the UK by 2050. That will cause some kind of low-level ethno-religious conflict. That terrifies me. I don't see the British establishment even taking it seriously. They seem to think that those who want their culture to remain vaguely similar and recognizable are bigots. I do think that ignorance and disrespect for the common people is going to spell the end of the Conservative Party, which is really, really bad for Wales, because it means England is going to go through an identity schism, and every single time it does that in history, there is a long period of, well, a few decades of anarchy, basically. So Celts aligning with this new Islamic bloc of the far left is short-sighted, it's stupid, but not only that, it's prejudiced. Because if you hate the English so much that you are willing to side with barbarian, savage suicide bombers who hate wider Western civilization and who in the end would choose to destroy Wales, yes, you are short-sighted, you are bigoted, and you are prejudiced, and you are letting your hatred of the English, as much as they annoy me sometimes, You are letting your hatred of them blind you to the fact that just because one group is your adversary does not make their enemy your friend. And we see places like Leicester, London, Birmingham, where these anti-Zionist mobs are marching. And it's no coincidence that at every point in the UK where there is a large and increasing Muslim population, you have this problem. This is the first symptoms, well, there have been some before, Corbyn, a cretin called Galloway, others, but this is really the first true manifestation of a mass popular wave that the Islamic community in Britain is able to manipulate. And here are two droplets. Welsh and Scottish nationalists in Celtic nationalism aligning with neo-Marxists and the cranks, basically, who hate Western civilization just to get back at the English. And these crazy cocaine-fueled neoliberal conservatives, who aren't really conservatives, obsessing over individualism to the point of sacrificing their own country on the altar of this ideology and ignoring what the people actually want. And this is a cocktail of discontent, because both of these help the growth of radical Islam and a third force coming into Britain that is only now beginning to pronounce itself. And I think some in the British establishment are like, oh fuck. And this is what I'm getting at. It's not likely that Welsh or Scottish nationalists will pluck up the rowdy rebelliousness to just walk out and leave with a fight. It's more likely that the English will implode fighting themselves with the problems that they've caused and brought upon themselves. And the Welsh and Scots will just quietly leave whilst the English are going crazy like they always do once every 300 or 400 years or so, and it's been about 340 years since the last one. I don't think I want to live in a society that's permanently divided. But that looks like what England is headed towards. And I think that is the end of the UK. I don't think Welsh and Scottish nationalists have the balls to just leave right now with the fight that it's going to take. No, it's going to take England imploding and the Welsh and Scots then saying, yeah, let's get out of here. I mean, I think that's generally how the UK ends. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. And diolch yn fawr iawn am wylio, thank you very much for watching.